Welcome to all. It is absolutely heartwarming to see how many wonderful faces there are out here in the audience today. We are incredibly lucky to have such a dynamic presenter as Jaylani Hussein, who is going to help us learn and understand a bit more about the challenges that Muslims in Minnesota are facing these days. After Mr. Hussein's presentation, there will be time for question and answer. And if you could please hold all questions until that time, we would greatly appreciate it. We are incredibly thankful that Mr. Hussein has taken time out of his busy week to come and spend Sunday afternoon with us. Please bear with me as I read a little bit about Mr. Hussein's very full biography. Mr. Hussein is currently the Executive Director of the Minnesota chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Mr. Hussein worked as the Community Liaison Officer at Metro State University and as a planner for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. In 2013, he created Zela Consultants to develop and offer cross-cultural training workshops on East African countries. Mr. Hussein has presented on the Somali culture to diverse public and private organizations across the U.S. He specializes in the areas of urban planning, community development, youth development, with over 8 years of experience in working in juvenile treatment centers for adjudicated youth, legal, and civil rights. Mr. Hussein has been active with various community organizations in Minnesota, including the Islamic Center of Minnesota Board of Directors, the Wilder Foundation Advisory Board, Muslim Youth of Minnesota Advisory Board, Islamic Resource Group Speakers Bureau, and the American Relief Agency for the Horn of Africa Board of Directors. He has traveled to the Horn of Africa twice on behalf of Araha, is that how I say that?
Yes.
Araha, thank you, to open a regional field office and oversee large-scale humanitarian projects during the Somali famine of 2011. In 2015, Mr. Hussein received the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits Annual Visionary Leader Award. He received the Immigrant of Distinction Award from the Minnesota Dakota chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. In 2016, Mr. Hussein was named the 2016 10 Outstanding Young Minnesotans by Minnesota JCs. In 2016, Mr. Hussein was appointed to the Minnesota Governor's Council on Law Enforcement and Community Relations. Mr. Hussein appears regularly on Minnesota's local television and radio stations. He has also appeared on national and international outlets, including the ABC News, CNN, Fox Business, NPR, the BBC, among others. Mr. Hussein's family emigrated from Somalia to Minnesota in 1993. He is trilingual, speaking English, Somali, and Arabic. Mr. Hussein holds degrees in community development and city planning from St. Cloud State University and political science from North Dakota State University. We are incredibly lucky and fortunate to have a man such as Mr. Hussein with us today. Please give him a warm welcome.
So it's really wonderful to be here with all of you. The presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about really Islamophobia, what is happening, what's going on, why are the tensions so high, why is the misinformation growing, why are neighbors turning to neighbors, and why are we not talking to each other. And at the end, I want to focus really heavily on what can we do. And I know that the audience today is mixed, so I hope in this conversation that I have today, for those who may find some of this information interesting or find this information to be a little bit of hagwash, whatever, I want to ask you to say that we need to talk. And this is not the most appropriate or most convincing way where I hold the microphone and you are listening. I really believe in a conversation where two people are sitting together, having a cup of tea or coffee or whatever your choice of drink is, and having a conversation not just about our faith and our community, where we came from, but also what makes us Minnesota. And I always say this to a lot of people, that I am as Minnesotan as they get these days. You know, not only from living here, but really being a Minnesotan. There's certain things about Minnesotans that you don't think about. And so, not too long ago, I was talking to these women that were flying back from Florida. They're Minnesotans. And then they were just had this like, oh, Minnesotans are wonderful, whatever. And they told me something interesting, which is Minnesotans, when we pass other people, we say things like, oops. I don't know if you know that. Before you say excuse me, we say oops, then we say excuse me. So then I was like, okay. Then I became so self-conscious that later day when I had a flight, I kept saying oops all the way to the gate. I was like, oops, oops, and I was so self-conscious. I was like, what am I doing? So it's interesting, you know, the reality is once you land here in Minnesota, whether you are a transplant or your family has lived here for generations, you become a Minnesotan real quick. Whether it's the slap of the cold ice, you know, windshield, or the fact of the matter you enjoy the great outdoors like the boundary waters and everything. So in this presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, what CARE is doing, and explaining what is the Islamophobia. Then we'll talk a little bit about what are the factors involved, and finally we'll end with what are we talking about, how to respond, how to change the narrative. Justice. Really, that's the goal for CARE, to be a leading advocate for justice and also mutual understanding. And this is a really important part of the work that we do at CARE. I spend nearly 40% of my time talking to groups just like you. Church groups, community groups, employers, and others. And the reason why is because in most reports, most recent study show that most Americans say that they have little or no understanding about Islam. And so educating folks about Muslims is really critical. Even though the American history is filled with Islam and Muslims from the inception. Yet we only identify the American Muslim narrative today in context to newer immigrants. In fact, 30% of the Muslims in the United States today are African Americans, descendants of slaves. You will never see them on MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News because it's easier to put the immigrant Muslim in front of you because that is the easier way to otherize folks who don't belong. In fact, when we lost the great Muhammad Ali, most Americans could not understand that they were having mixed emotions. In one case, they loved this man for being this amazing boxer, and everybody remembers the favorite lines of, you know, sing like a bee, or butterfly, dance like a butterfly, sing like a bee, whatever. All of those beautiful. Okay, you guys can figure it out, but you know how wonderful. But some of us even forget the fact that he fought tooth and nail not to go to Vietnam because he was a Muslim, not as an actor or a superstar who was avoiding combat. In fact, if Muhammad Ali did go to Vietnam, he would just be on tours of signing autographs and building morale. That's literally what these individuals did. But he fought tooth and nail, lost his ability to fight, lost his money, because he said, I am Muslim, and Islam teaches me to be peace, and I have no business going to Vietnam. That, we forget about that entire story, that entire history, and that's why today I want us to call and remind us, our neighbors, and our family members that the story of the American Muslims today is not about the new immigrants like me who came from Somalia, who look a little different, talk a little bit funny, and whatever. But then at the end of the day, even here, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the slides, but there's a rich history of Muslims here in this area that outdate every single one of us in this room today. And there are the Syrian immigrants who today people are having havoc about the idea of bringing Syrians, but they were the first really established Muslims, particularly here in the Midwest, in the turn of the century, to benefit from the Homestead Act. So, going back to CARE, what is CARE? Our mission is to enhance the understanding of Islam, encourage dialogue. I want to just focus on them. We want to encourage dialogue. As difficult as it sounds, and today we might have some conversations that sound a little difficult, and I welcome all of those. But I want you to recognize that we have to encourage dialogue, protect civil liberties of American Muslims, and build coalitions that build a mutual understanding. So at CARE, Minnesota, we do a lot of things. Of the things that we do are civil rights. We have a legal department that handles civil rights cases. Next slide, I'll mention a little bit of the breakdown of those cases. We do media relations. We educate our local media outlets about understanding, effectively working with our Muslim clients, Muslim community members. We do civic engagement. We encourage, particularly the new immigrant population, to be more civically engaged. It's interesting, actually, in Minnesota, we have some of the most civically minded, newer immigrants than in the entire country. The Cedar Riverside area has nearly 97 voter turnout. That's unheard of in any other immigrant community because of the fact that community members recognize that. However, that number is not shared across the state, particularly in greater Minnesota, where Muslims' votes and new immigrant votes are much actually higher per percentage based on the population, lower population. We do trainings and education, and that's something I welcome all of you. I have some material outside you can grab. Invite us to your workspace. We can do cultural diversity presentations. Invite us to your community, your church. We'll be more than happy to do that. And we have partners like the Islamic Resource Group and the Building Blocks of Islam. And actually, I'm honored to say we have someone who has been behind a lot of the early interfaith dialogues, perhaps the oldest interfaith dialogue in the country that is known today of American Muslims and Christian dialogue, which has started here in Minnesota. Dr. Owais Bayunis, who is with us today, you can just maybe wave, from the Islamic Center. He's a retired, and he's someone who has been doing this work for an extremely long time. I encourage all of you to maybe reach out to him. Look like a lot of Muslims, but this past year and a half, I've gained a lot of donors that look like you, who are supporting the work that we do. There's always a question about who funds us and what do we do. So a little bit about the civil rights cases, what type of cases we handle, and what's the breakdown. So these are represented retainer agreement type of cases. We handle thousands of calls about legal questions, but the cases that actually lead to being retained, right now we're exponential growth, as you can possibly see. 360 last year. We're probably going to break a little bit more than that this year. We're getting a case almost every single day. I'm glad to report that we do have a positive track of closing these cases in a positive settlement or addressing the issue. But as you can see, the biggest number is employment discrimination. And that means that people who are at work are being denied the right to pray, to wear a hijab while at work, and other types of religious requirements. Most cases, it's really driven out of ignorance. So for example, someone works for a job for 6 months, and they're showing up, their first, the bell starts at 6 in the morning, that's when they show up. And for the first 6 months when they start that job, they're not praying, because the prayer schedule starts at the early sunrise, and as you know in Minnesota, that shifts throughout the year. Right? Our sunset goes from 4:30 in the winter to all the way to 9 p.m. So the prayer schedule also moves. So this gentleman, for example, this is actually a case, he comes to work and now the prayer is at 6 in the morning. So he tells his manager, hey, I have to pray. And the manager's like, I've never seen you pray before. And because of this poor communication and unable to understand, the manager fires this individual. And now we work with the company to educate them. And in most cases, I would almost say 90%, if not more, they want the employee back because they're hard workers and there's no real issue around the employee particularly. It's more around the fact of not understanding. So we try to educate, and we're doing a great work in that. We still need help to be able to educate more employers so that they're not also wasting money addressing this issue. Finally, we also believe a lot of our Muslim women are actually getting screened out of job. Because someone will look at them and say, oh, wearing all this loose clothes, you can't work there, you can't work there, you can't work, because they're all the conveyor belts. And we say, don't look at it as a problem, look at it, we have solutions to these issues, including, let's put on a lab coat, for example. So if a Muslim woman who's wearing loose clothes puts on a lab coat, Now that lap coat protects her from any conveyor belt, and she feels still modest enough to wear what she's wearing from inside and outside as well. So we work with employers to find solutions to be able to do the right thing. Islamophobia, I'm sorry, maybe this darkens a little slide. This is the way we explain it. This is the way we would it can be described as this kind of irrational fear and hatred and hostility. And in most cases, it's really based on negative stereotypes and ignorance. And finally leads to these policies to kind of otherize Muslims. That is really what we're challenging and what we need to know. Why phobia? Why not just anti-Muslim sentiment or that? And the reality is, in most cases, most people, because they have little understanding of Islam and Muslims, then add that information to the 90% of information being given about Muslims today, particularly on our airwaves, which are negative. Right, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But everything is based off of this religious intolerance that we've had as a history of our country. If you're Irish Catholic in this room, you could remember what that meant 40 years ago, 35 years ago, 60 years ago. Right? Irish Catholics, perhaps the more pushed out group, and we remember John F. Kennedy, the way people looked at him. They thought he was going to change the United States Constitution. He was going to have his own Sharia, right? Change the United States Constitution. That didn't happen, but people feared. And so this is permeating from both spaces, you know, from faith, from this other, we don't understand these other people, what their faiths are, right? So even here in Minnesota, you know, Catholics didn't get along with Lutherans. It's not a secret. Now everybody's okay, but, right? You can marry that person from that community. Norwegians and Swedes. I was talking to an elderly woman this morning at the church in White Bear, and she mentioned to me and said that, you know, as in my lifetime, I saw Norwegians and Swedes not get along. And I would not know the difference, by the way, just to be honest. You know, I just know the lutefisk might be across the board. Right? So what happened was religious intolerance led to this, which Muslims are facing too. Right? Employment discrimination, I mentioned that in the earlier slide. Denial of public accommodations, organized discrimination, I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, discriminatory laws that drive this idea of authorization. So I mentioned those earlier slides, and you can see exactly, it's a reflection of what happened to other groups as well, right? And so one of the other things I want to also, for you to understand, is we have government agencies pretty high, right? And that number really is around FBI representation. So in our community, the FBI visits Muslim community households, not because there's an actual active investigation. They just are mapping the community. They're just going to go to people's houses and talk to them, figure out where they are in their legal map. And that's, many of you today, if you get a knock on the door and it's the FBI, you're probably freaking out. And imagine somebody who came from a police state where they can't say no to the police. And in the middle of the night, your family could be taken and you will never know what happened to them. So many of the clients that we get are the few brave ones or the few ones who are tired of having tea with the FBI. And all we do is really just assert their right to have a legal representation. And in most cases, the case never moves on beyond that. And that's something many of you are unaware of, that our community has this struggle, particularly with the local FBI. In fact, there was a report that was recently produced that mentioned that the FBI were working well with the border protection folks. So at the border, whenever you had a wonderful interview in the secondary conversation, so you had a secondary interview, they would actually then report to the FBI and say, hey, Ali is a really good candidate for potential recruitment. Then 2 weeks later, Ali gets visited by the FBI and they're like, Ali, you're an amazing guy, we heard. And I was like, what? Who told you what? And then eventually they would say, you know, we just want to have people who help us with this or that, etc. I think the FBI should focus more on all types of threats because we notice that they are making a lot of mistakes even when they're being reported on issues. So it's a cycle. Islamophobia is a major cycle, and I will just explain some of the components of that. Number one is ignorance and fear. Right? Ignorance exists. Most people would say that they have not had a relationship or a conversation with a Muslim. Most people have not visited a mosque. Most people can't identify their nearest Muslim neighbor. It's just a reality we live in today. Yet, the conversations about Muslims is pretty high. Like, you can't turn on the TV today without hearing something about Muslims. Ignorance with fear is really a bad combination. And unfortunately, we talk about media in Hollywood, Islamophobia industry. Because of this ignorance, there has turned to be an entire network of folks that recognize that people don't know anything, that want to fill this void with rumor fill, with misinformation, and generalization, and things like this. It's based on religious intolerance, which means religious groups are also using this types of language to further the anti-Muslim sentiment. And finally, organized hate networks, speaker circuit, and then finally, we see hate crimes happen. So let's talk about ignorance. I mentioned this ago. All of the recent reports say that Muslims are the least favorable religious group, least known anything about, and more mysterious around, right? When there was a recent study, and I shared this earlier too, but it's a recent study on the New York Times that looked at a 25-year window. And they have identified a number of topics, including cancer, cocaine, all types of different things, and then including Islam and Muslims. What they found out is the majority of those titles, or those topics, were covered around 30% negative stories. But when it came to Islam and Muslims, it was almost 60%, at 57%. So if you're reading the New York Times for 25 years, you still would have a slanted view of Islam and Muslims. This is an unfortunate reality. And when it comes to Hollywood, the biggest educator, by the way, Hollywood is the biggest educator because they educate customs, culture, and they really use the fears and the narratives within our community to exploit, right? So, for example, for the longest period of time, you will not see a Muslim without some sort of turban. And now our Sikh community see the brunt of the anti-Muslim attacks because they're easily identified as Muslim. In fact, most Muslim men do not wear turbans. Only a small percentage do, particularly from a particular area, and it's not something worn every single day, right? But today, Sikh men are a target because of the fact they wear turbans, because Hollywood has laid the foundation for that type of view. Today, you can't find a Muslim character in any sitcom who doesn't have some sort of a ticking time bomb. I mean, if you watch Homeland, 24, name it. I think we're making a little change now because one of my shows that I like to watch is Walking Dead. And there is a Muslim woman now in Walking Dead. She's African American. She's not been eaten yet. She's gotten a speaking role. These are all positive things, folks. And I'm looking forward to seeing her continue into whatever the next story looks like in that show. But Hollywood is big. And so reversing Islamophobia is really reversing all of this. Better coverage, more balanced coverage, and Hollywood actually depicting Muslims in the manner that they exist here in the United States, right? Not in the terrorist and that type of language. In fact, as I mentioned, a terrorist attack happening, let's say in Kabul today, all you hear is a number. 100 people were killed today. Imagine if CNN decided to just show us 5 stories of those people who were killed. We would start to have more recognition that this evil that's happening in our world impacts all of us. We would humanize, just like we do here in the United States when there's a terrorist attack or all kinds of attack, we recognize that this is something that we all are responsible for. But in the United States here, the message in the media only covers the number, and they spend the rest of the time telling us who ISIS is, and who these terrorist organizations are, and how they're coming to get us, and how our Muslim community is responsible somehow. In fact, the 2016 election, both parties used anti-Muslim sentiments in their coverage of how to address radicalization. Now you're thinking a little bit, you're like, what did Hillary do? Right? We all know what Trump did, but what did Hillary do? Hillary, she actually came to Minnesota. She ran and said that they're going to stop terrorism in the country, but she said something which is problematic. She said we have to befriend the Muslims because they know who the terrorists are. She said it in a way that many of you didn't pick it up, but she said it that we have to work with our Muslim neighbors because they are on the front lines of challenging terrorism. Trust me, when I wake up every morning, I don't go around and Gestapo our Muslim community and be like, where are you at on the radicals? And it also projects that the Muslim community is not interested in the safety and the security and the well-being of our neighbors. It is a requirement as a Muslim to not only take care of yourself, but your 40 neighbors each direction. That's a requirement of Muslims, to protect, to the point where the Prophet Muhammad, when he was talked about the neighbor, Angel Gabriel talked to him about the neighbor, that the Prophet was concerned that the neighbor would have inheritance rights over that family. So the neighbor is something very important to the Muslims. But again, it plays to this idea, we don't know what radicalization terrorism is happening. Muslims know it, so let's go and figure out. In fact, in most cases, whenever somebody's acting deranged, Muslims are reporting those individuals to law enforcement. Primary GOP voters completely agreed with me. For most of us, we're like, what? But for the GOP voters at the time, they completely agreed with that. I would argue, actually say, those GOP voters, because there's a lot of GOP voters who did not agree with that. There is an industry of Islamophobia, and this industry is playing to both sides of the aisle. I don't want you to think here that the conservative right group, right? So conservative right side of the spectrum is where the only anti-Muslim is organizing. It's actually on both sides. Some of you in this room might not know, but Ayan Hirsi Ali is an Islamophobe. Her book you can find in Barnes & Noble's faster than probably the Quran. Okay? And in fact, she says exactly the same thing as Bridget Gabriel, who plays to the more conservative right. Ayan plays to the conservative left. So she will appear on Bill Maher, Bridget will appear on Fox News, Sean Hannity. And they say the exact same. They say something is inherently wrong with Islam. We can't do Islam. Let's get rid of it. Let's change it. Right? That's their message. And in fact, they usually never share the same stage. But last year, they were both, Bridget invited Ayan, and they both shared the same stage, talking the same exact manner. So I wanted you to recognize that the play to this idea of radicalization, terrorism, which are really key indicators of pushes of Islamophobia, are being pushed on both sides of the political aisle. When Muslims are asked, or if there are prejudice toward Muslims in this current environment, Muslims reported 60%. Interesting enough, the Jewish community who were also in the survey, they said 66%. And the only way to explain that is the Jewish community are still going through anti-Semitism, and they know the BS through anomalies. They know when they hear things, it's not an anomaly, it's not one-off. These issues are happening. The Islamophobia Network, so our organization, we have a website called islamophobia.org. Don't forget that one. It's pretty simple. And we have content there, information about the network, about individuals, about speakers. And that gives you a little bit of understanding of what's going on. And in that, we have produced a recent report that identified about 74 organizations. And actually 33 were the core organizations that do this work, and about 41 that are outer core. The 41 outer core organizations are organizations that kind of do this work of anti-Muslim organizing in the country, but the 33 spend the majority of their time on that. So if we just look at the 33, not the 41, that we know that they're well-funded. So the report said that about $205 million over a span of 4 years. So we're talking about $40 to $60 million that we can account for. Now these are national organizations. So every state has some affiliate group that either get the talking points or work directly with these organizations. So we're just catching what the 33 organizations are spending. Right? In fact, also their speakers get well funded on. What is the talking points? What is the aim of these organizations? It's really boiled down to a couple of things. Number one, it's to frame American Muslims as a danger to America. That's the number one thing. Every talking point says Muslims are here to get you. Right? And whatever story they can fabricate, whatever story they can grab to say this story applies to every single Muslim, they'll do it. Every terrorist attack that happens here in the United States where there's a Muslim involved, the media coverage, actually there's a recent report, I didn't memorize the data yet, but there's a recent report that's announced this past month where it showed that the number of times where a terrorist attack happened, or any type of attack happened here domestically, where a Muslim name was involved, there's like 4 times or more covered in the newspaper. There are more people that are going to cover that than anything else. So inventing danger of Sharia, creeping Sharia, that the Sharia is here to take over the United States, that Muslims are here to change the United States Constitution. We have a hidden agenda. We are here secretly, and we will come to an age. By the way, that exact word for word talking points were exactly used against the Catholics by the KKK. The KKK during the 1930s, when they rebranded themselves, their entire conspiracy conversation was based on the Catholics are here on the direction of the Pope, and they're here to lay the framework and the foundation to be in every organization. And then one day, Pope John will tell little John at the JFK what to do. Literally. And that's exactly the same thing that's happening today. In fact, today the Muslims are not even 1% of the population, but yet we can turn the 99% to accept Sharia. And in most cases, Sharia just means like killing and all of those other things. Everything that the Sharia tells you not to do apparently is being told that that's what Sharia is. In fact, most Muslim scholars in the world today would identify and say America has more principles that adhere to Sharia than in most Muslim majority countries. Can I say that again? America has more principles that adhere to Sharia than most countries that say they have Sharia. Okay? So hate crimes have been going up. 2015, we saw a sharp increase of attacks of mosques in this country. We went from the previous year of like 29 to 71, and all of them happening around the time when the election for 2016 started. So it completely changed how we look at it. The anti-Muslim network nationally is well organized, but there's one fact that all of you should know. All of those people who just dislike Muslims today, they dislike everybody else, folks. It's not Muslims are just on their latest radar. So Daniel Pipes, who's kind of the more intellectual organizer of that group, you can see here, he was said stuff like brown people have different standard of hygiene, you know, and so, again, well-funded. Most people will not know these groups, okay? Now, if you're going to donate, you should probably know, right? So as you know, there was a story that broke this past weekend, on Friday, I believe, where we found out the former CEO of Best Buy, Brian Anderson, and the former founder, both donated to an organization that had these despicable anti-Muslim ads, anti-immigrant ads. In fact, their excuse right now is like, well, we just didn't know they created those ads. If they just read the organization's bio, the entire organization was created after the Ground Zero Muslim controversy in New York. So they were did not give women or the black slaves the right to vote. You know, if you say something like that, you're probably not the brightest bulb in the room. but he Act for America or Eagle Forum, and then they actually go around. And in fact, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho are considered what we think of test states. It's a state where they will actually spend lobbying money to get it passed because there's a less opposition, because there are probably more people who will agree with some of this. And in fact, once it gets law, then they go around to other states and say, hey, state senator, it got passed in Idaho, right? So why not? And actually right now, there was a bill passed this year, another anti-Sharia bill in Idaho. Okay, so that's how these things work. And again, some of the statements that people have said about why they support this bill included, this guy from South Dakota said, it's alarming how many of our sisters and daughters who attend American universities are now marrying Muslim men. In fact, if you just change the word Muslim there, and you put any other men who are minority, Japanese men, Somali man, black man, Asian, whatever, it's the same story repeating again to a different community. So, how many of you remember this sign? None of you, right? Okay, Ron remembers it. This sign was put up in St. Cloud area, attacking the Catholic charities for resettling Islamists. I don't know what that is. There's two words, Islam and Muslims. One is for the religion, one is for the people. But anyways, Islamist. And eventually came down, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Minnesota. So in Minnesota, we have three things that are really playing well to each other. One, we have hate groups. I'll talk a little bit about them, including militias. We have anti-Muslim speakers that travel across the state. Anti-Muslim refugee legislation that is being promoted today. So there is a Muslim ban state version that is being worked in today. Most of you have not heard about this. different. You heard about the Muslim ban that Trump has done, right? But the reality on the state level is a different conversation. The conversation now has been brewing, and we've had governor hopefuls have actually written op-eds about this, as well as others, and they're saying, hey, immigrants cost us money. Refugees cost us a lot of money. So why don't we just hold off for now until we know the exact cost of the immigrants and immigration. Until we know more, let's hold off. That sounds like a Muslim ban state level to me. In fact, if you look at the state demographer, our state is increasing because of immigrants who are coming in. And that is because our state has a huge decline in young, ready, and able workforce. We have a crisis that we're going to be hitting soon in the 2040 if we do not bring more young people, because we have an aging population in the state of Minnesota. So if you look at today, what's the #1 driving force for immigrants to come to Minnesota? Is jobs. There is no more safety net on welfare. I challenge one of you to live off on a monthly check or a monthly allowance that someone on welfare has. I guarantee you, you would have to go to a food shop. But it's easy for us to say the immigrants are here to take our jobs. It's easy for us to accept that. And unfortunately, a lot of this language fits very well to a much more economically depressed areas where it's easy for them to connect their fears of Muslims to economics. So let's talk about them. So Osama Dakdouk, for example, many of you have not heard of him. How many of you heard of this name? Just want to get a general. Well, we got some people. Okay. So he travels across greater Minnesota, and we've been able to identify that from his list of things that he's been to Minnesota and this area, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, but mostly in Minnesota, about 67 times since 2013. We estimate maybe he has talked to about 10,000 people in greater Minnesota, or in this area. What is he saying? I mean, I wish you attend one of his events. He's just screaming and yelling, telling people Muslims will kill you for any reason, all types of stuff. Right? And in fact, he uses the fact that he's an Egyptian and he lived in Egypt and he's a Christian to tell the story of why he knows more about Islam. And he has his own translation of the Quran, very similar to the paper that you got here. Okay, so what about hate groups? So there are 12 known hate groups in the state of Minnesota, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is the traditional hate groups that existed with white nationalists that we know of. Right? So, like for example, we have an organization in Minnesota. Now they renamed themselves. They're called You Can Run, But You Cannot Hide. Right? So that's easy to know. Like, what kind of organization is that? Or white, or Aryan Strike Force, or easy names for you to be like, oh, that sounds very fishy. In fact, in most organizing today that's happening that are doing this work, they don't use those names. So the Southern Poverty Law Center is only able to track those who have a website, have language, and have been doing this work. So this number is kind of the more extreme hate groups I would identify. In fact, hate groups in Minnesota are under the radar. Okay? So a couple of things that they do. Number one, they're unincorporated groups, which means there's no bank account, there's no name, there's no organization, there's no committee, right? And secondly, they have minimal online presence. So they're not going to go out there and tell people that, because they don't want to put people in a position where they feel defensive. Right? So it's like doing it behind one layer. In addition to that, deceptive names. Right? Very deceptive names. So something like Wilmer First. Okay? Or they will use, for example, Friends of something, Friends of Hudson. Or Coalition for a Peaceful whatever city. And so if you get a flyer from that organization, how many of you would probably read it? Most of us. Like Friends of Jaylani? I'd be happy to read that. So that naming is playing really good into how they're organizing, particularly on this information. How many of you heard of the 3% militia? Some of you may have. So I'm going to show with you a short video, and I'm not going to play the audio, but it will explode apart. So they're, and in other videos, subsequent videos that they have on their website, actually it's a video of them going into buildings and in tactical gear and preparing themselves for kind of an urban warfare. So there's the video, the little mosque, and then they're going to shoot directly at it. And there it goes, it explodes. So interesting enough, we reported this group because we actually had someone who knows the group very well and is actually connected to the group somehow, who told us a lot of information. Obviously I can't share with you right now, but the FBI is definitely investigating into this group. The 3% militia group have chapters all over the country, a very militarized group. And right now, the bombers of the mosque in Bloomington appear to be belonging to a militia group. We cannot associate them to the 3% or any other militia, but definitely they belong to some sort of a militia group. So this is how it works. We have hate groups, militias, anti-Muslim speakers, this idea of refugee, which is a Minnesota way of hiding behind Islamophobia, and then hate crimes lead to that. Right, so we have a rise in hate crimes. Most of the issues that we see happening today that we get constant flow of is bullying in schools. Great deal of that. But we allow the school districts to really work toward allowing for kids to figure things out on their own. Right? So you're not going to hear a lot about every bullying incident that happens in school or every issue that happens in schools. Only when a school district fails to respond to a student's needs, that's when we put a little bit of pressure on the school district. Refugees are the problem. The only reason why refugees are even in St. Cloud, to be honest with you, is because of the jobs there. Once the jobs are gone, there's really no reason for people to live where they can't find jobs that are applicable to them. So St. Cloud has that. I'm not going to play this audio for the sake of time, but this was a case that happened before 2015. And it involved a couple here where a woman held them at a gunpoint thinking that they were hostile in any way. And unfortunately, nothing happened. Fortunately, nothing happened, but she was definitely charged for attacking this couple with that. Particularly when it comes to hate crimes, as I mentioned, how many of you remember this case? Most people remember this one, Applebee's. Yeah. So, you know, women are the #1 target, easily targetable because of their hijab. And even actually on online chat forums, we find that people say attack the women, scare the women. That way, people will leave. In fact, the testimony of those who bombed the mosque in Bloomington said that they were there to scare. They were there to scare the Muslim community in a way of leaving the country. So again, a lot of cases involving women, you know, all types of hate crimes. And I'll be honest with you, from where I sit at CARE Minnesota, I believe this is just the tip of an iceberg. My community does not report hate crimes. This might shock you. The Somali, in particular the Muslim community, in most cases will not report hate crimes. And that's because they're afraid of revenge. They're afraid of being doubled down on, so they dismiss it in any way possible. I have had a lot of people who come to me after Friday prayers and say, hey, this happened. I'm like, well, can you just report it? We don't. And a lot of times, sometimes people think that at CARE, every case we have, we're just going to run to the media and make a big deal out of it. It's not the case. Every case we deal with the sensitivity and the determination of every client. But according to the FBI, 2/3 of all hate crime go underreported. So people are just dismissing it. And then also fear of retaliation. Once people know that I actually reported them to the police, now they might do more things to harm me, right? And I think I'll just encourage, especially the youth in this room today, you could be a really great advocate and be a good supporter for your school district, and particularly your school environment. In most cases, just like I said, all of these things apply, ignorance and misunderstandings, and we have to be there to check in. And one thing we encourage school districts is to check in with all students, particularly minority students and Muslims, just to make sure that there isn't an ongoing bullying that's happening, because then that leads to flare incidents that we often deal with, where some student reacts, but then we find out for the last 6 to 8 months they've been bullied and they haven't had anybody address their issue. So in addition to that, I'm wrapping up actually. So you know, this conversation about terrorism, particularly in Minnesota, has played out very well for this anti-Muslim sentiment in our state. And in fact, those cases of young men trying to join ISIS have been used as a way to say that this is something that's happened in Minnesota. I mean, no one can go to the Twin Cities. There's no-go zones. There's places where police can't go.
And by the way, this language is coming from Europe because Europe has been using those kind of language of no-go zones. So it's been reported that you can go to Minnesota. And we had a Fox News reporter who came into Twin Cities who literally was going around to people as they're walking and say, "Do you speak English?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And they kept walking away, and he's like, "Another person who doesn't speak English." So it was a horrible segment, not really any journalistic integrity there. But again, playing to this idea, and we've had, like I said, during the Obama administration, we had both parties that pushed this anti-Muslim narrative through this CVE, countering violence extremism. In fact, what most people don't in Minnesota about the cases in Minneapolis is that there's a similar case in Colorado involved the same U.S. prosecutor, the same prosecuting system in Colorado, where two young Somalis and one Sudanese girl left Colorado and then tried to join ISIS and were stopped in Germany and brought back. And in fact, the U.S. prosecutor there said that they were victims of radicalization, online radicalization, rather than treating them as this terrorist that we have to put away for life. And so here in Minneapolis, it was a whole different narrative that we talked about. These young men also were played into this narrative of being recruited, right, into gangs, being recruited into online predator. All of that does exist, and we have to be able to address it. But here in Minnesota, we addressed it from a very criminal, and unfortunately there are boys, there are men, and there are black. And in this country, you're found guilty for being just black and be associated with crime, unfortunately. And that's a hard truth to stomach, but it's definitely playing well into the story as well. And finally, but in fact, you know what the most interesting thing was? I was not there to speak. I just came there to listen and be in the room. But people heard that Jaylani was there from CARE, and they asked me the one question they like to ask: am I a terrorist? So there's an older gentleman who said, "Do you know that CARE is a terrorist?" to Governor Dayton. And then they pulled me back into the room. I was outside the room, and he asked me, I was like, "I'm not a terrorist." But the fact, again, my organization today is the unco-conspirator for the Holy Land case, which means I'm a terrorist organization. In fact, there are 284 organizations listed there, and it was a political move by the judge. Until today, that is the only line that the anti-Muslim group has against my organization. And they say we support terrorist organizations, we don't denounce terrorism. I'll be honest with you, there is no organization in the United States that holds press conferences to condemn terrorism than CARE. We hold more press conferences, and every single time we hold a press conference, people still email us and say, "Where are the Muslims condemning this?" Right? We don't ask that when white shooters shoot people. We don't ask if white people should condemn, or if someone from a specific faith does that or does an abortion clinic. We don't go around and ask people who they belong to. In fact, anyone who does a crime that's horrific, who's white, gets the, "Let's wait a minute, let's figure out what actually happened. Where's the mental state of this person?" Right? So, I know I'm running a little bit out. I'll just mention some of this. In our 2017 report, the numbers are up of anti-Muslim incidents, 580% in one case. And again, Muslims are the target of the anti-Muslim sentiment. Particularly, I want to just focus on women. Women are the #1 subject being targeted, right? And all types of incidents. We've had an incident in Minnesota, I don't know if any of you know, where the Twin Cities, where young men were shot at by a guy who knew them only within a 5-minute window. He walked outside of a bar, he saw young Muslim men, they were wearing religious clothing. Somebody yelled out, "F Muslims." They continued to walk, they got in their car, the man came in front of them and said, "Well, what if I said it, what were you going to do about it?" And then they didn't know what was going on, so one of them started to get out of the car, and then as they were getting out of the car, this guy starts shooting, and actually hits 2 of them. Thank God, one of them actually ducked, he would have hit him straight in his head. But this guy now is serving 39 years in prison for doing that. So let's talk a little bit about how to challenge. What do we need to do? Number 1, you have to educate folks. You really have to be able to educate folks, and you have to educate yourself. But most importantly, you have to be able to listen to people. I'm going to say this again, you have to be able to listen to people. We're not listening to each other anymore. We're throwing things at each other, right? We are so polarized in our nation today, people are afraid to share their opinions because somebody's going to stamp it out. Let's listen to each other. And the second thing is, let's speak up. There are more anti-Muslim op-eds in the state of Minnesota than op-eds that promote inclusivity and address the Muslim community? Why is one group more interested in writing and persuading others and another group is completely silent? We have to be able to do more to educate. There is a discord, there is a vacuum, there is room for conversation. We can't shut it down. Advocate, we need people to advocate, right? We need to be able to expose hate. Right? When someone who has so much influence in our society today is funding anti-Muslim ads that were supposed to sway voters in 2016, we can't accept that. Right? So Brian Anderson, he doesn't belong in the most important spaces of our community, making decisions while making terrible decisions as he did here. And he has yet to even apologize. He said, I'm just not going to vote for anyone. I'm not going to give money to them anymore. That's the answer? I hope some of you saw that video. The video was just like as distasteful as you can find. And then finally, empower people. We got to empower people. We have to do it in many ways. We have to share the narrative of the Muslim community. The Muslim community has been here for a long time. We're not new to this area. We outdate everyone who's living here. So this idea that we're new, as I mentioned earlier, we have this beautiful story of Muslims that are in, this is the mosque that some of you could visit in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1934. And this one in Ross, North Dakota from 1912, 1929, I think. So these communities existed long before us immigrants from East Africa showed up, folks. Right? And if you can find today many places, Abdullah chocolates. How many of you had Abdullah chocolates, right? You can go, you won't have to go too far to find Muslims. I guarantee you Muslims came to Stillwater and trade on this river, right? Because we have history in Minnesota of Muslim salesmen who used to go up and down and sell goods all the time. The idea, the American Muslim community is very diverse, right? We have a CEO of a Fortune 500 company here in Medtronic. Omar Ishaq. We have the first ever congressman in the history of the United States who's Muslim, who, by the way, is African American, which is a lot of people don't. Again, going back to that 30%, right? We have leaders of Black Lives Matter. Rashad Turner here in St. Paul, who is African American, who's Muslim. We have Muslims who serve as a prosecutor, who recently used to serve as a prosecutor. The first ever Muslim Somali immigrant, an immigrant in Iran, right? The profession that most of you don't know about, that actually Muslims play a big role, is doctors, right? I guarantee you, you've probably interacted with a doctor before a Muslim doctor before any other profession. Right? They represent 10 to 15% of the entire doctor field in the country, right? Some of the best cardiologists in the state of Minnesota are Muslim, and we actually have three free health clinics that operate here in the Twin Cities, run by Muslim physicians and their partners and colleagues and friends. In fact, most of you have not heard of young Muslim men, particularly Somali, joining the United States Army. How many of you heard that story? Never, right? In most cases, a few people here. How many of you heard young men joining ISIS? Right? Is NPR like loving that story, and everybody on Star Tribune loves that story? No one wants to talk about young men joining the United States Army. My best friends, three of my close friends who I grew up with in Columbia Heights, three of them serve in the three branches of the United States Army. And I grew up with those young guys going off, learning. Actually, one of them came back really skinny. I was like, my goodness, what happened after boot camp? But the point is, that's a story we don't hear about. You don't hear about that. And that's the stories that we have to uplift. So we have a...
Is the first step. Islamophobia works for me. Ask your doctor if it's right for you.
Don't ask your doctor. They don't got time. It's just sure gun, folks, but it could be placebo effect or something. So one of the things I wanted to say is that we have to change the narrative, we have to speak up, and we have to pitch a lot of positive stories, particularly in the media. I encourage all of you to do that. A lot of times you don't realize at the end of every telecast there's something called kicker. And that's when newscasts typically show us the good story, right? The story that makes us feel better about all the gloom and doom they started off the telecast with. And interesting enough, a lot of times when they don't have a kicker story, they look at each other and start laughing about something nonsense. And that's the way they're going to send you off with a positive story. So pitch positive stories. And if you don't believe me, trust me, in the last year and a half, we saw a lot of stories about police officers doing random things that appeared at the end of every telecast. I remember one story which aired, which showed a police officer who was off duty, who paid for someone's meal who forgot their wallet. Now that's a unique story, but come on now, that's not like the most. I mean, let's say the officer took a homeless person and fed him for the day, then he took him into the shelter or whatever. I would take that story, right? That would be a nice story. But off duty, how many of us have paid for somebody else's wallet? We've done that all the time. How many do you think he's going to get on the telecast? Joanne paid for someone else's? But saying positive stories, you know, a lot of times you don't hear about this, right? You hear about this sometimes, but you don't hear about this. That the Muslims are serving in the United States Army, but also police officers, right? Including Hassan Mead, who ran for the United States Olympic team from right here from Minnesota, ran in the 1,500 meters. In fact, he ran with a crowded race of Somalis. We're all running for different countries, by the way. So here's Hassan, and the guy who eventually won is Mohammed Farah, or Mo Farah from Britain. And this guy, I forgot his name, but he runs for Canada or Sweden. So the 4 guys running were also originally from Somalia in the same race. Young women playing basketball. This young woman won an award from President Obama, obviously. If you live in St. Cloud, the first ever model who wore a hijab from our state here, and particularly from St. Cloud. And so we have these powerful young people that are doing the work. In fact, if we don't share these stories, this is the story that gets commonly shared. Right? Young men joining terrorist organizations. And it's not a fake story, it's a real story. But if that's all you're hearing, why would you ever be wanting to talk to somebody who's a Muslim? Right? So, I remind this, and I'll end with this. Dr. King, you know, we celebrated 50 years of his unfortunate assassination, but a history that he has taught us. And so he said something very powerful. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So I encourage you both to listen and be silent, and do not be silent anymore. And now I will open for Q&A, and I don't know how long I took because I got really excited and really excited. So we'll do Q&A, and I want to just say before I start, ask your question, please, and allow for as many people to ask questions. I close them down?
They said here that it was all over the paper.
Okay,
now
so
be fair and don't laugh, because I'm you're asking questions and this is not easy for me.
Absolutely.
So why was that?
Okay, so let me answer your question. First of all, thank you for asking the question. There were 2 speakers that spoke. The question was, I mentioned earlier that I said, I wish you could hear what Osama Dakduk, the gentleman that I showed you here, the speaker who's been traveling, you could hear him. I corrected that. I said, I wish you could heard what he said. However, the question is, why did my organization shut down 2 speakers who were planning to be here? Actually, there were 2. One, what's his name? Sharam Hadadi, and then the other one, which is today, was happening at Bloomington Hotel there. His name is John Gondola. So, in fact,
there are 4 others.
Well, okay, so we'll just do those 2 for now. So, as an organization, we don't shut down anti-Muslim speakers. Okay? We talk about who they are so people understand who they are. Now, when people hear that there's an anti-Muslim speaker coming, and it was reported on NPR, a lot of people on their own accordance called the school districts or wherever they were presenting and told them we don't want the speaker to come, etc., etc. And they have their full right to do that. I personally believe it's a great place to start a conversation. If there are people coming to hear that message, we should be able to listen to it, and we should be able to counter it and provide feedback to that person who's speaking. I actually don't think shutting it down does not make it any better for us. So, whatever allegation people might have of my organization, I did not send a single email. I didn't even call the hotel. I was encouraging people to just go to the event. Okay? So, we want people to say the things that they have to say, right? And as a group of people, we should be able to have those conversations. So, I would just say that we didn't do anything about that. And I hope you can prove me wrong if you have actual evidence of that.
So first I'd like to dovetail on the young lady's comment. I don't see her at the moment, but the only reason I'm here and a number of other people are here today, I much prefer being with my grandkids and my children, is because that program was shut down and there were several speakers scheduled this afternoon and this evening in Bloomington. It was canceled because of terroristic threats and threats of violence and protest. That's a fact. It's irrefutable. Your program, you're very compelling. A great speaker. Smooth, in fact. I would say that only because I'm from New York and New Jersey, so I'm looking at this and thinking, not bad.
Thank you.
The problem I find with it, and I have a question, yes. And I offered this question to you when I saw you make your presentation in St. Cloud, where you frankly insulted a number of women in the audience. And at one point,
What is the question, please?
my question is, would you accept again a challenge to a 2-hour debate, unedited, panel discussion? You want people to talk with each other, listen to each other, with other people sitting on the panel who might offer a different perspective. On-air, unedited, television, radio. I used to host a weekly radio program for 8 years, KDWA Radio. Had a cable TV program. I'd like to see that debate. You're invited. Standing invitation. Would you do that?
Is that your question?
Would you do that?
Is that your question? I need to get you to questions so I get other people to
That's
ask
my
their
question.
Okay. So, he's inviting me for a dialogue. First of all, I don't refuse dialogues.
A balanced discussion.
I don't refuse dialogues.
You're welcome.
And I'd be more than happy to have a conversation. And I've always said that. And in fact, every time I'm ever invited anywhere, and particularly in Greater Minnesota, I stick around and try to have a conversation with folks. I reach out to folks regardless whether they agree with me or disagree with me.
Do we have your word on
So,
that?
I will welcome any dialogue anywhere
A
that
panel discussion.
I believe you will continue this later.
All right. I want to be clear.
So I'll be more than happy to have a conversation with you and a dialogue, whatever it is, whatever format you want to do.
Perfect.
The reality is, and I want to answer that question by some clarification. The reality is, you have to understand right now that we have a crisis around Islamophobia. And that crisis is about recognizing two things that I've mentioned. Number one, most people today who have, I would say, unfavorable views toward Muslims have not interacted with Muslims. I would say most. Some people have. Most have not interacted with Muslims. Once they interact with Muslims, they would change their opinion. In fact, I was in Bemidji and I met a group of people who were completely in opposition to what I had to say. And later that week, actually, my car broke down there. And so I stayed around for a couple of days and I met a gentleman at a gas station. And he came up to me and he actually recognized the same thing you recognize. He's like, you're that smooth talker. I was like, man, I don't know. But anyway, so I was like, did you hear about the event? And then he said, no, I was at the event. And then I asked him and I said, hey, what is your concern? So he asked me and said, people are moving up in here. We don't know where all these people are coming from. Why are they coming? So I explained to him, I said, listen, do you know why there's more Somalis living in Pelican Rapid, Minnesota than Alexandria, Bemidji, Duluth, all combined, including more other cities in that area? Why is that? I said, I don't know. I said, because there's a turkey plant in Pelican Rapid, and people have been living there since 1996. Okay? People want to get jobs, they want to have a decent life, they want to do that. And Duluth doesn't offer that. That's why there's not that many people, Muslims, particularly East Africans, in Duluth, nor in Bemidji, nor in Alexandria, nor in River Falls. All are, by the way, bigger than the 4,000 population in Pelican Rapid. And that struck a chord with him. That was what he took from me. And I could see immediately his nonverbals calmed down, and then he told me something, which was the truth. He said, I only had to play, or only had to go on what Osama Daktouk, the guy I mentioned to you, has been saying. And he said, I wish more of your folks come out and talk to us so we have a balanced conversation around these topics. The truth will always prevail, no matter how difficult the conversation is. Because the majority of the people are interested in the truth. Would you say that?
Yes.
I would say that. Yes.
Hi. So I'm part of the Alliance, and just for my knowledge and for the others on the Alliance, how can we learn more about what your beliefs are. I would say that I'm ignorant in a large way about what the true beliefs of Islam are.
Absolutely.
So where can we really understand that and potentially do some myth busting so that we're more educated when we go out?
Absolutely. So we have an advocates training. If you go on our website and you sign up, you can join a more, I would say, facilitated conversation around understanding more about Islam and Muslims. There are mainly 4 questions that Muslims get asked about today, right? Terrorism, Sharia, women's subjugation, and misquotations from the Quran. Those are the 4 thematic questions. Sharia, the fact that Muslims are here to change the United States Constitution. We're not even 1%, in fact, and even that's not the goal of the Sharia itself. Sharia is here to adhere to the Constitution of the United States. Second, when it comes to terrorism, majority of the victims of today's terrorism are Muslim. It does not say that majority of the people who are acting and committing terrorist attack are not Muslim. They are. Majority of them are. But in fact, the Muslims are killed every single day across the world, and so Muslims have the greatest to gain and the greatest to lose. In fact, if you look at the religious theology around Islam and Muslims, the most talked about are the Khawarij group, which are the outliers that would come in time where they play out the card of Islam, but they're really extremist. So if you look in Islamic teachings, we know about ISIS. We've been told about groups like that they would come. And Muslims have been recommended and required to fight those people to protect humanity from this extremism. Secondly, women's subjugation. Women, and by the way, there are a lot of Muslim women here today. I would be honored if any of them would talk about that. But just to add to it, I would say, in most cases, if you go to Muslim majority countries, there are a lot of women issues, just like here in the United States, right? In fact, the story that many of you don't hear about is the story of Khadija, the Prophet's first wife. And I guarantee you, Khadija would not fit in today's even most modern woman. She would not fit in that category. She was her own boss. She was a CEO of her own company. She married a guy who was 25 when she was 40. That would be offensive today in our society. She was the bread maker. She was the person who had the money and influence, right? And in fact, she was gracious enough when Muhammad became a prophet that she allowed for him to even leave, right? So this is a story that many of you don't hear about. Is the oppression of the hijab an oppression? Ask any Muslim woman. They'll tell you from their own mouth what that means to them. And in fact, we forget to ask the question of the habit. And finally, I would say the misquotations of the Quran. That's the #1 question. The Quran says this and this and that.